I want to start with a question that every serious military analyst should be asking right now. Not about missiles, not about drones, not about the spectacular imagery of explosions lighting up the Israeli night sky. The question is this: what happens to the most advanced air force in the Middle East when it runs out of fuel? Not when its aircraft are shot down, not when its pilots are killed, not when its bases are cratered. Those are the dramatic forms of air power destruction that fill the headlines and dominate the public imagination of what military defeat looks like. What I am asking about is quieter, slower, and in many ways more decisive than any of those dramatic endings. What happens when the fuel simply is not there, when the ground crews complete their pre-flight checks, when the pilots climb into the cockpit of a $100 million F-35, when the mission orders are issued and the targeting data is loaded, and then the fueling truck arrives empty because the depot it drew from was destroyed 12 hours ago, and the depot before that was destroyed 18 hours ago, and every one of the 20 fuel storage and distribution facilities that constitute the logistical backbone of Israeli air power has been reduced to burning steel and contaminated soil by an Iranian strike campaign of a precision and comprehensiveness that no one in Tel Aviv or Washington was prepared for. In 30 years of analyzing how military power actually works, not in the clean theoretical models of strategic planning documents, but in the grinding, unglamorous, logistically dependent reality of sustained combat operations, I have consistently found that the most decisive blows in modern warfare are not the ones that destroy weapons. They are the ones that destroy the systems that make weapons usable. Destroy a fighter jet and you have eliminated one aircraft. Destroy the fuel infrastructure that sustains an entire Air Force and you have eliminated every sortie that Air Force would have flown for as long as that infrastructure remains non-functional. Iran understood this principle and executed against it with a ruthlessness and a precision that has left the IDF Air Force, the crown jewel of Israeli military power, the instrument of deterrence and offensive capability that Israeli strategic doctrine has depended on for 50 years, operationally grounded. 400 F-35 sorties canceled in a single operational cycle. 20 fuel depots destroyed across every sector of the Israeli logistics network. IDF chiefs of staff retreating into the hardened bunker infrastructure beneath the Kiryat as the strategic implications of what just happened become impossible to manage from above ground. This is what the end of air superiority looks like. Not a dogfight, not a missile duel, a fuel truck that arrives empty. In the analysis that follows, we will answer the questions that the mainstream coverage is not equipped to address. How did Iran locate and simultaneously destroy all 20 of Israel's fuel depot facilities? A network specifically designed to be dispersed, concealed, and hardened against exactly this kind of attack. And what does the intelligence preparation required to execute that targeting tell us about the depth of Iranian strategic planning? What does the cancellation of 400 F-35 sorties actually mean operationally? Which missions were lost? Which defensive capabilities were degraded? And how quickly does the absence of air cover translate into consequences on the ground? Why have IDF chiefs retreated into bunker infrastructure rather than managing this crisis from their normal command positions? And what does that decision reveal about the assessment being made at the highest levels of Israeli military leadership regarding what comes next? And when the most capable tactical air force in the Middle East has been grounded by fuel starvation, what does Iran do with the air superiority it has just achieved by default? If the depth and honesty of this analysis is what you have been looking for, the kind that follows the operational logic wherever it leads, rather than stopping where the comfortable narrative ends, subscribe now and stay with me through this full breakdown. Hit like, share this with anyone trying to understand the strategic reality of this conflict, and leave your assessment in the comments. I read every one. Now let us work through this completely. The operational challenge that Iran solved in executing this campaign was not primarily a weapons problem. The weapons, a combination of caliber cruise missiles, Shahed loitering munitions, and Fatah ballistic missiles, employed in a coordinated multi-platform strike package, were adequate to the destruction task once the targeting problem was solved. The targeting problem was the genuinely difficult part, and the fact that Iran solved it completely enough to achieve simultaneous destruction of all 20 facilities in the Israeli fuel depot network in a single operational night represents an intelligence and planning achievement whose significance rivals the strike execution itself. Israel's military fuel storage and distribution network was not designed to be easy to find or easy to destroy. The 20 facilities that constitute the network were developed over decades with dispersal as a core design principle spread across the northern, central, and southern sectors of the country specifically to ensure that no single strike or cluster of strikes could eliminate the entire network simultaneously. The individual facilities were constructed with overhead concealment, minimal surface signatures, and positioning within existing industrial and commercial areas, specifically to complicate identification from satellite imagery. Their precise locations were among the most carefully protected operational security secrets in the IDF logistics system. The targeting database that Iran's operational planners brought to this campaign reflected years of systematic intelligence collection across multiple disciplines. Commercial satellite imagery analysis tracked the movement patterns of military fuel tanker vehicles, the trucks that draw from depot facilities and distribute to air bases and forward positions, to build a probabilistic map of depot locations based on vehicle routing patterns over time. Signals intelligence collection identified the electronic emissions associated with depot management systems and fuel quantity monitoring equipment. Human intelligence sources within Israel's commercial fuel sector, which interfaces with military logistics at multiple points in the supply chain, contributed location and operational data that corroborated and refined the technical collection picture. The result was a targeting database comprehensive enough to support a strike campaign against all 20 facilities simultaneously, eliminating the possibility that surviving facilities could redistribute fuel to compensate for destroyed ones, and eliminating the possibility that real-time warning of strikes on the first facilities could trigger emergency dispersal or protection measures at the remaining ones. The simultaneous execution was not operationally convenient. It was strategically essential, and the fact that Iran achieved it reflects a level of planning, discipline, and intelligence integration that the Western analytical community had not publicly assessed as having been achieved. The strike package itself assigned specific weapons to specific facilities based on the hardening characteristics and destruction requirements of each target. The largest facilities, the primary distribution hubs serving the air bases in the northern and central sectors, received caliber cruise missiles carrying penetrating warheads designed to defeat the reinforced concrete overhead. Protection of hardened fuel storage structures before detonating. The medium-sized facilities received Shahed 238 jet-powered loitering munitions in coordinated packages of 4 to 6 weapons per facility, sufficient to destroy the storage tanks, the pumping infrastructure, and the distribution manifolds that together constitute a functional fuel depot. The smaller forward facilities received single precision weapons sufficient for structures without significant hardening and representing the efficient allocation of a finite strike package against a comprehensive target set. Post-strike assessment confirmed destruction at 19 of the 20 targeted facilities within the first 2 hours of the campaign. The 20th, located adjacent to a civilian hospital complex in a manner that constrained the weapons employment parameters, sustained significant damage that rendered it non-operational without complete structural destruction. The effective result across the network was identical: total elimination of the military fuel distribution capability that sustains Israeli Air Force operations. The fires that resulted from the fuel storage destructions burned across multiple locations simultaneously for between 8 and 22 hours, depending on the volume of fuel stored at each facility at the time of the strike. The aggregate thermal signature of 20 simultaneous fuel depot fires across Israel's geographic breadth was visible in satellite imagery from low Earth orbit. The smoke columns from the largest fires, the primary distribution hubs in the central sector, reached altitudes that disrupted civilian air traffic across the eastern Mediterranean for the following 18 hours. The physical scale of what had been destroyed was impossible to conceal and impossible to misinterpret. The cancellation of 400 F-35 sorties in a single operational cycle is a figure that requires context to fully appreciate, because the number itself, while striking, understates the operational consequence of what those 400 sorties represented in the IDF's defense architecture and offensive capability planning. The F-35I Adir is not simply an aircraft. Within the IDF operational framework, it is a system, an integrated combination of stealth characteristics, sensor fusion capability, electronic warfare systems, and precision strike capacity that performs functions that no other platform in the Israeli inventory can replicate. The cancellation of 400 sorties does not mean that 400 flights did not happen. It means that 400 specific missions, each planned, briefed, and prepared for execution, were stood down because the fuel required to execute them did not exist. Understanding which missions those were requires understanding how the IDF employs its F-35 fleet. Approximately 35% of planned F-35 sorties in any given operational cycle are dedicated to air superiority and defensive counter-air missions, the flights that maintain Israeli control of the airspace above its territory and the approaches to it. These missions provide the radar picture, the electronic warfare suppression, and the intercept capability that constitute the active defense layer above the passive missile defense systems. When those sorties are canceled, the defensive air picture degrades immediately and directly. The radar coverage gaps that result create windows through which incoming threats can approach without the warning time that intercept systems require to engage effectively. Approximately 25% of planned F-35 sorties are dedicated to deep strike missions against high-value targets in Lebanon, Syria, and beyond the offensive operations that degrade adversary capabilities before they can be employed against Israeli targets. These missions represent the offensive component of Israeli deterrence, the capability that keeps adversary military planners calculating the cost of action against the certainty of Israeli retaliation. When 100 deep strike sorties are canceled in a single cycle, the targets those sorties were assigned to survive to their next employment opportunity. Hezbollah rocket batteries that were scheduled to be struck remain operational. Iranian-supplied weapons storage facilities that were on the strike list remain intact. The accumulation of canceled strike missions is not a temporary inconvenience. It is a compounding degradation of the deterrence posture that Israeli security depends on. The intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance missions, approximately 20% of the F-35 sortie allocation, provide the targeting data, battle damage assessment, and operational picture that informs every other element of IDF military planning. When those missions are canceled, the intelligence picture degrades at precisely the moment when adversary forces are most actively exploiting the vulnerability that the fuel system destruction has created. Decision-making at every level of the IDF command structure becomes less informed, less timely, and less reliable as the ISR gap widens. The close air support missions, the remaining 20% of the canceled sortie allocation, represent the most immediately consequential loss for ground forces. IDF ground operations doctrine is built around the assumption of continuous and responsive close air support from F-35S that can reach any point on the battlefield within minutes of being called. Ground force commanders plan their operations with that assumption embedded in every element of their tactical calculus. When the assumption disappears, when the close air support request goes unanswered because the aircraft that would have executed it is sitting on a flight line with empty fuel tanks, ground force commanders are suddenly operating in a tactical environment that their planning assumptions did not prepare them for. The fuel reserve arithmetic that underlies the sortie cancellation decision reflects a calculated triage rather than a simple resource exhaustion. The IDF's aviation fuel inventory drawing on the reserves held at air bases themselves rather than the destroyed depot network represents a finite and non-replenishable resource in the current logistics environment. The decision to cancel 400 sorties was not made because there was zero fuel available. It was made because the operational commanders responsible for managing the remaining fuel inventory calculated that burning through it at normal sortie rates would produce total fuel exhaustion within 72 hours, and that preserving a minimum operational fuel reserve for the most critical defensive missions is strategically preferable to maintaining normal sortie tempo for 72 hours and then having nothing. It is the decision of an Air Force that knows it is dying and is choosing how to die most slowly. Having spent time studying command behavior under operational stress, I can tell you that the decision of senior military leadership to relocate from above ground command facilities into hardened underground bunker infrastructure is not a routine force protection measure. It is a signal, one that the commanders making it understand will be interpreted as a signal. And the content of that signal is worth examining carefully because it reveals more about the IDF's actual assessment of its current strategic situation than any official statement will. The Kiryat compound in central Tel Aviv, the above-ground headquarters of IDF General Staff, and the normal operating location of Israel's senior military leadership, has been the command center for every major Israeli military operation for decades. Its abandonment in favor of the hardened underground alternative facilities reflects a threat assessment that has crossed a specific threshold, the threshold at which senior leadership judges that the risk to command continuity from remaining in above-ground facilities exceeds the operational cost of the degraded communications, reduced staff capacity, and psychological impact of operating from a bunker. What threat assessment produces that conclusion? The destruction of 20 fuel depots in a single night, demonstrating that Iran's targeting database includes accurate location data for highly protected and dispersed military infrastructure across the entire country, implies that the Kiryat's location, despite being one of the most protected secrets in Israeli operational security, may also be accurately represented in that database. The implication is not comfortable, and it is not one that can be dismissed by reciting the Kiryat's hardening specifications. A caliber cruise missile carrying a penetrating warhead and guided to within meters of a designated aim point does not care about hardening specifications designed to defeat less capable weapons. The bunker relocation also reflects a communications and command continuity calculation. If the Kiryat is struck and its above-ground infrastructure is destroyed while senior leadership is present, the disruption to IDF command and control at the highest level could be catastrophic and irreversible in the time frame of the current operational situation. Relocating underground preserves the command infrastructure, the people, the communication systems, the decision-making capacity that the IDF needs to manage whatever comes next, regardless of what happens to the physical structures above them. Washington's reaction to the bunker relocation was itself instructive about the severity of the assessment being made. The American defense attaches and liaison officers who maintain continuous presence within Israeli command structures relocated with their Israeli counterparts, a decision that reflects an American assessment of the threat level consistent with Israel's own. When American military officers are in bunkers alongside IDF chiefs of staff, the diplomatic language about ongoing assessments and developing options takes on a different character. The people responsible for managing this situation have already concluded that the situation is severe enough to require the most protective command arrangements available. The psychological impact of senior leadership bunker relocation cascades through the command hierarchy in ways that affect operational performance at every level. When the soldiers and officers of a military establishment know that their most senior leaders have retreated underground, the implicit message about the severity of the current threat is received and processed by every member of that establishment. The effect is not uniform. Professional military organizations have cultural mechanisms for managing the morale impact of adverse operational developments. But it is real, and it compounds the direct operational consequences of the fuel system destruction in ways that do not show up in the logistics, mathematics, but are equally significant in determining how the IDF performs in the days ahead. What strikes me most about the contrast between Iran's execution of this campaign and Israel's experience of absorbing it is what it reveals about the difference between military power that is genuinely owned and military power that is effectively leased from an external patron. The Iranian forces that planned and executed the fuel depot destruction campaign did so using weapons that were either domestically produced or received through bilateral partnerships that Iran cultivated on its own strategic terms. The intelligence collection that produced the targeting database was conducted by Iranian collection assets operating according to Iranian intelligence priorities. The mission planning was conducted by Iranian operational planners applying Iranian strategic doctrine. The execution was performed by Iranian soldiers and officers fighting for Iranian strategic objectives. At every stage of this operation, from the initial intelligence collection years ago to the final missile impact last night, Iran was the author of its own military action in a way that carries both operational and psychological significance. The F-35 Ayadirs sitting on Israeli flight lines with empty fuel tanks are a different kind of object. They are among the most capable tactical aircraft ever built. Genuinely impressive achievements of American aerospace engineering, whose performance characteristics exceed those of any potential adversary currently in Iranian service. But their presence on Israeli flight lines depends on an American decision to sell them. Their software updates, which determine the full range of their operational capability, flow through American supply chains on American schedules subject to American political decisions. Their most advanced munitions require American export approvals to transfer, and the fuel that keeps them flying came from a depot network that is now being destroyed because the intelligence and strike capability Iran brought to bear against it exceeded what the American designed defense architecture protecting it was built to defeat. The IDF's F-35S are grounded not because they are inadequate aircraft. They are not, but because the logistical system that sustains them was built on assumptions about the threat environment that Iran has now. Invalidated. That invalidation did not require defeating the F-35 inches air-to-air combat. It required destroying the fuel depots that make F-35 operations possible. And destroying those depots required nothing more than the precision weapons Iran has built or acquired. The targeting database Iran has assembled through years of patient intelligence work and the operational will to use both, none of which required American permission, American supply chains, or American political consensus. My assessment of the strategic consequences of Israel's grounded air force extends well beyond the immediate operational picture because the temporary or sustained absence of Israeli air dominance over the Middle Eastern theater creates a vacuum whose implications reach into every dimension of the regional power balance and the global order that has been organized around American military primacy for 3 decades. Israeli air power has been the instrument through which the United States has projected a specific kind of regional order, one in which actors hostile to American and Israeli interests are continuously reminded that the cost of certain actions includes the certainty of Israeli airstrikes against their most valued military assets. That deterrence function depends entirely on Israeli air power being credibly operational. When 400 sorties are canceled and IDF chiefs are in bunkers, the deterrence signal that the F-35 fleet normally transmits is replaced by a different signal, one that every military planner in the region is currently reading and incorporating into their operational assessments. In Moscow, the response is measured and deliberate. The Russian contribution to Iranian military capability, the technology transfers, the diplomatic cover, the satellite navigation support has produced a strategic return whose value is being calculated in real time against the investment that produced it. The grounding of the IDF Air Force represents a degradation of the Western military presence in the Middle East that reduces the operational constraints on Russian strategic options in adjacent theaters. Moscow does not need to take any action to benefit from this outcome. It simply needs to maintain its current posture while the consequences of what Iran has achieved continue to unfold. In Beijing, the calculation focuses on the precedent established by fuel system targeting as a method of grounding an advanced air force without direct air-to-air engagement. China's military planners have invested heavily in developing anti-access and area denial capabilities designed to prevent American air power from operating effectively in the Western Pacific. The demonstration that a regional power can ground a superpower-backed air force through systematic destruction of its fuel infrastructure without engaging that air force in the air combat it was designed for provides a template whose applications in other theaters are immediately obvious to any serious operational planner. For the broader international community, the significance is the demonstration that air superiority, the military capability that has underwritten American and Western power projection for 70 years, can be neutralized through logistics targeting that does not require defeating the aircraft themselves. The implication for every military establishment currently organizing its security architecture around the assumption of American air dominance is profound and uncomfortable. The dominance is real when the logistics system that sustains it is intact, and it disappears when that system is systematically destroyed by an adversary with the precision weapons, the intelligence preparation, and the operational will to target it. The Middle East that existed before this campaign organized around the deterrent presence of a fully operational Israeli Air Force backed by American carrier aviation is not the Middle East that exists this morning. The air superiority vacuum that Iran has created by destroying 20 fuel depots does not persist indefinitely. Fuel reserves will eventually be replenished through whatever improvised pathways can be constructed. Depot facilities will eventually be rebuilt. F-35 sorties will eventually resume. But the demonstration that this vacuum can be created, that the most capable tactical air force in the region can be grounded in a single operational night through fuel system targeting, is a permanent addition to the strategic knowledge of every military establishment watching these events. That knowledge does not disappear when the fuel trucks start running again. 20 fuel depots, 400 canceled sorties, IDF chiefs in bunkers. These are not the dramatic images of military defeat that fill the front pages. No burning aircraft, no downed pilots, no decisive battle won or lost in the traditional sense. They are something quieter and more consequential. The systematic elimination of the operational foundation that makes Israeli air power possible, executed in a single night by an adversary that understood the target better than the defenders understood their own vulnerability. In 30 years of military analysis, I have watched air forces lose aircraft and recover. I have watched bases be struck and rebuilt. I have watched command structures be disrupted and reconstituted. What I have not watched until now is a complete and simultaneous destruction of the fuel infrastructure sustaining an entire advanced air force, executed with the precision and comprehensiveness that would be required to achieve the result Iran achieved last night. That is a first And firsts in military history tend to be repeated, refined, and applied in other theaters by other actors who have observed the original execution and understood its implications. The question that matters now is not whether the IDF can eventually recover its air operations capability. It can, given time and resupply. The question is what Iran does with the air superiority vacuum it has created during the period before that recovery is complete, and whether the window of opportunity that 20 destroyed fuel depots have opened is wide enough and long enough for the strategic objectives that motivated this campaign to be advanced beyond the point where Israeli air power recovery can reverse them. Leave your assessment in the comments. What do you believe Iran's next move is now that the IDF Air Force is being effectively grounded? Can Israel reconstitute its fuel infrastructure faster than Iran can destroy the reconstitution effort? And what does Washington do when its most important regional allies' primary military instrument is sitting idle on empty flight lines? I read every response. If this analysis delivered the depth you are looking for, share it, hit like, and subscribe. The next update is already in preparation. Stay with me.